Real question I want you to think about, I'm hoping we can discuss, is what privatization means when correctly described. Most of us who teach in the public higher education sector believe that public higher education is partly justified as a road to greater economic equality through social, intellectual, moral, personal uplift in a context in which economic growth produces benefits for everyone. We teach in institutions which regard themselves as producing greater economic inequality, and which sell themselves to students as the principal drivers of greater economic inequality. Our institutions increasingly depend for their financing on the idea that in good times and bad, a growing income gap in our society is our most important product, the most important result of higher education, and that it is the way in which higher education should finance itself and should sell itself, namely by regarding it as our most important product and not, as I think it is, our most important political and social problem. Most of us, I think, are afraid that if we say this, or even if we criticize this, or even if we say that it's no longer true that higher education pays for itself, we may lose our students and our jobs, and certainly even more of our state funding. And so we have really failed to come up with an articulate and intellectually coherent critique of the master plan as it has now become, and more importantly, a defense of the master plan as it still could and should be. In other words, the essence of privatization is that taxpayer or public financing is now replaced by private borrowing that is only possible because the line of credit against which students borrow is ultimately itself backed by taxpayers. It's not a private system at all. Now, the idea that students can and should be willing to pay ever higher tuition because universities simply have to cost more is partly a matter of institutional fact, and more importantly, I want to suggest, a matter of social theory, which I'm much more qualified to address than I am institutional fact. The institutional fact is simply that what equal educational opportunity has come to mean is that all students are now eligible to pay for their higher education on credit. When I say all students are now eligible, what I mean is just that. Higher income students are equally eligible for credit, regardless of their need. Credit is not limited to the poor. But it is a form of financial aid because lower income students are eligible for credit regardless of their credit ratings, regardless, in other words, of their potential or future income, and regardless of how much they already owe. What makes it, in other words, a form of financial aid is precisely that it is subprime, in just the way that mortgage lending was very briefly a form of financial aid in this country just a few years ago. This subprime credit is only available because there are federal guarantees. It is the same line of credit that has made possible the existence and growth of all proprietary universities, University of Phoenix, Academy of Art College, most of which are funded entirely because they are front ends for federal student loans. In fact, this is where students go when they must go to school in order to live off credit rather than where they go when they need to borrow in order to attend school. Since 1965, since the Stafford loan started, public universities have believed that they were left out of this scheme, that their students were essentially worse than they would be because the scheme subsidized students who went to private universities. Until the Reagan era, the tuition at private universities was actually part of the financial aid need formula. If you went to a private, it was designed by people at Harvard who didn't think you should have to decide between Harvard and UMass based on Harvard's tuition, so if you got into Harvard, you needed more money. It's also true of any beauty college as opposed to any community college. My campus almost closed because of that, but because the Reagan administration had true conservatives, they changed the need formula and saved at least the peripheral campuses in the UC system for another 2 decades. UC and other middle-income students really saw that, UC and other public universities really saw that middle-income students should be and are more willing to take on increased personal debt to attend privates and proprietaries than they are to attend UC. And it just bothered them. How much credit can you actually get just because you get a ticket of admission to UC? Well, for an undergraduate degree, it's $31,000 to $50,000 in lifetime federally guaranteed subprime credit. In addition, your parents can take out probably another $20,000 of loans, although their credit rating is checked, unlike students. And if you happen to get yourself an undergraduate degree, your lifetime borrowing limit is $164,000. In this context, why wouldn't private credit backed by federal loans be seen as the most attractive revenue source for public universities? Why wouldn't it? As long as your ability to borrow, in other words, continues to rise, all public universities need to do in order to get more money is to increase your need to borrow. That's what tuition is. At least if your willingness to continue to borrow does continue to rise, and the federal credit limit continues to rise as well. I said, in other words, that this model of privatization, which I'm now trying to specify for you, depends on an institutional fact. The institutional fact is there's no credit check for taking out a student loan. You simply have to be within the $50,000 or the $164,000. And that's how the federal government really underwrites the whole educational system on a public basis without distinguishing between public and private. You still need a social theory in addition to that institutional fact to explain what is going on. In other words, why states think that they can financialize higher education by using tuition growth as an ever-increasing income stream, an income stream that is essentially recession-proof and that will grow faster than the economy as a whole. I want to try to persuade you today that that social theory is very clear, easy to specify, and easy to attack. Because the social theory is based essentially on simply assuming that it is a structural fact about all economies, or at least all economies in this era, that they have the properties that the California economy happened to have, roughly speaking, during the high-tech boom between Proposition 13, 1978, and the high-tech bubble bursting in 1999 or 2000. And here's how UC's internal story goes. I've heard it in my years on the Budget Committee. It's not necessarily the story they tell publicly. Well, what they say is that the master plan, free public higher education, is really a consequence of a very exceptional moment in California history. The post-Cold War moment when people came to California, when California's economy was led by unionized defense contractors who got cost-plus contracts so they could simply pass on labor wage increases to the federal government. Essentially, their labor force was high school grads who had union jobs and got sufficient and regular wage increases so that they were willing to vote for tax-financed benefits such as free college education for their children. And really, what we learned from this brief period of the master plan is that higher education finances economic growth. Look at the success of California. UC claims credit for it. But guess what? Higher economic growth increases income inequality. It is a property of higher economic growth that it produces greater income inequality. And so, in a sense, transcends the social conditions that made free higher education possible, because there are now greater economic disparities. 1960, the year of the master plan, California's income dispersion, the level of inequality, was one of the lowest in the country, which is why we got the master plan. By the end of the high-tech boom, it was one of the highest. And so what we really have here is a situation where even if you think GDP growth, or at the state level, whatever the state equivalent to that would be, increases mean income, the important fact is that it increases not merely the mean, but the variance. And by increasing the variance, it decreases the level of taxpayer support for free public higher education. So, just as governments should be willing to invest in higher education because we know that that's what produced California's economic growth, so the theory tells us, it's also true that if taxpayers as a whole are not willing to do this, because a lot of them are now being left behind by economic growth, the same reasons why taxpayers should be willing to invest because education produces economic growth are reasons why individuals should be willing to borrow because economic growth produces income inequality, which is now our most important product, although we don't want to tell that to the students we have. Example, simple example. Between 2000 and 2008, nationally, GDP increased by 10%, and the median individual income went down by 4%. Per capita GDP increased by 10%. Median income went down by 4% before the crash. So people should regard benefiting from growing income inequality as a return on their investment in higher education, just as the government should regard greater economic growth and a growing tax base as a return on its investment. But we are now in that sweet spot where we can fund it either way. And the serious question is whether income inequality is more likely to increase or will increase faster than the economy. And the nice thing about income inequality is that it's recession-proof. It goes up whether the economy goes up or whether the economy goes down, and that's what the university is counting on.